Okay, we are at the top of the hour, so let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is going on beyond best practices in QuickBooks Online, diving into banking and reconciliation. And I'm Valerie. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick things off. There is a question box where you can type to me. I don't have any helpers with me today answering questions, so I'll just be occasionally peeking in. There are a lot more of you than there are of me, so I'll try and get to everyone's questions. If I miss you, I'll follow up after the webinar. And it looks like, yeah, we've got a good audience today, so let's dive right in. Oh, there's also a copy of the handout, which is just my slide deck. So if you'd like to review a PDF of that later, feel free. There should be a handout section on that GoToWebinar control panel for you. Okay, so to introduce myself, I'm Valerie Heckman. I'm a senior product consultant on the Intuit team working in the accountant segment. I've been with Intuit 7 going on 8 years, and I'm located in Naperville, Illinois, where it is kind of gloomy and fall-like outside today. And my role is really to help accounting professionals get more comfortable in QuickBooks Online. And I'm excited that today we're diving into my very favorite topic, which is the bank feeds and the reconciliation. So here's our agenda for this afternoon. We will go through the bank feed workflow, how to bring bank transactions into QuickBooks, because there are a few methods. We'll talk through the different options for working with those transactions once you've downloaded them in, and how to set up and use bank rules. And once we've covered the bank feed in depth, we'll jump over into reconciliation, which really these two topics go hand in hand, right? We're going to add and match transactions in the bank feed. Those get marked cleared, and then we go to reconcile. So we'll cover the steps to reconciliation, what the discrepancy report looks like, and what the reporting overall is like for reconciling in QuickBooks Online. So I hope that sounds great to everybody. And let's dive into the bank feeds themselves. And I've just got a quick question, a little polling question for some audience participation here. Have you used the bank feeds in QuickBooks Online? Just want to get a feel for who's here today. We may have a lot of beginners. We may have a lot of experts, maybe some folks that are in between. So let me know. Okay. All right, looks like some of you have used the majority of you have used the feeds, but are just here for some tips for proficiency. So that's awesome, but a lot of you are brand new to it. If you are an expert and just here for information, I hope that I do have a little something for everyone as we're going through. So to get grounded, why use the bank feeds in QuickBooks Online? Maybe you have your own reasons for using them, for those of you who have, but that's also a conversation you may be having with your clients, right? So why do we use the bank feeds? Number one is to reduce manual data entry. The financial institutions are putting this data on their websites or available to download from their websites. We may as well leverage that, right, and bring those transactions into QuickBooks Online without having to key everything in. Because we're getting that data from the bank, we're improving accuracy. Hopefully, what the record shows on the bank's website matches up with what happened in real life. So, of course, if we're leveraging that, we should have improved accuracy versus typing things in and potentially transposing numbers. One of my favorites, keeping the books as up-to-date as possible. If we connect the bank accounts to QuickBooks Online, we can look for new transactions each day and work with them as they happen versus waiting until we get that bank statement and put things in after the fact. When we have the bank account connected up to QuickBooks Online, we can view the balances on the QBO dashboard, right? We can see what the balance is at the bank versus what's in QuickBooks, how many transactions are waiting to review, what's unreconciled and reconciled, and really get that snapshot of how up-to-date the books are. And then making reconciliation faster, which we're going to look at in action towards the end of the webinar. I like to also ground us in what the workflow looks like with banking and reconciling in QuickBooks Online. So the idea here is that the bank transactions post to the bank website, and then we update the feed in QuickBooks. Now, QuickBooks is going to look for new transactions each day when a bank account is connected up, and we'll go through all the steps of getting the connection going. But we can click the update button if we've got it connected to online banking and pull new information in. Or there is an alternative method of bringing bank data in, which is uploading a file, right? And I'll talk through what the options are for that. And then once we update the bank feed in QuickBooks, the transactions will be ready to review and accept. And QuickBooks Online is actually going to look through those transactions and say, does this have a match already in the register? Have you set up a custom rule to tell QuickBooks what to do with a transaction that meets certain conditions? Are there any transactions we recognize from past behavior? And then is there any transfer data, like where money's moving from one account to another? And we'll go into each of these in more depth. So after QuickBooks Online has done that, right, it's kind of recognized some of the transactions, tried to match them up to records already in the books. You or your client who's ever working in the bank feed will accept things in, go through and match and add. And as you do that, the transactions move into QuickBooks and are marked as cleared in the register, right? Because we know that they happened at the bank. And then when the time comes, of course, we use our bank statement to reconcile at the end of the period to make sure that everything that is cleared reflects the bank record of activity. And that whole process is much smoother if we treat the bank feed like the first leg of reconciliation. Now, of course, we would complete this process for each bank account and credit card account. I'm just going to say bank today instead of financial institution or distinguishing between bank and credit card accounts. So when I say bank, it can mean any of that, right? The financial institutions that we connect up to QuickBooks or get bank data from. Okay, so let's talk about the two ways to bring bank data into QuickBooks Online. There's really two methods here. So the first is connecting the financial institution up. QuickBooks Online has connections to over 14,000 financial institutions, so there's a lot of banks that you can connect with right in the product. So you go into our directory, you look for that bank, choose it from the list, and then follow the steps to essentially get that connection going. So using login information to authenticate. The steps will vary a little bit by bank. I'm going to give you an example of what one bank looks like. But for the most part, you're using the same information that's used to sign into online banking to give the bank and QuickBooks permission to talk to each other. You'll map up where those transactions will go once they come into QuickBooks, right? Which bank account does this correspond to in the chart of accounts? And then that connection is there going forward, looks for new transactions each day, but you can also click update to have it refresh to the most recent information, right? The most recent stuff that's posted on the bank website. The second method is more manual. It's a file upload. You log into the bank's website. Every bank website is a little different, but usually there's somewhere where you can find and download the history into one of these 4 supported formats. And some of these formats might be familiar to you from other tools, right? QuickBooks Desktop, Quicken, Mint, those types of things. So if you find the download in that format, you can come into QuickBooks Online. Under the update menu, there's a file upload. We'll have you map some fields, and then you can bring the transactions in, but it's only going to bring whatever's in that file, right? So you'll have to do a manual update each time you want to bring new stuff in. So a bit more time consuming, but it is an option if the bank doesn't connect with QuickBooks Online, or if you'd prefer to do it manually for whatever reason. And I'll go through each of these methods in more detail here. So if we're connecting up, the very first time you come into the bank feed, or if you click add account, if you've already been in there with a few accounts connected, first things first, we pull up the directory to find the bank, search by name or URL. I recommend searching by the URL, the web address, because a lot of banks have very similar website names or similar names in general. So whatever website is used to log into online banking is what you want to make sure you're using here. If you type a name and it doesn't find any results, it's going to give you a couple troubleshooting steps, right? And that's where they say, hey, copy and paste the web address that's used to sign into this bank's website. And then if, we don't have that connection, you can request that we add the bank, because we're always working to form connections with more financial institutions. So you can request that from us. But let's say that you find the bank, and I'm just using Chase as a general example here. You're going to follow the steps for login on authentication. So you chose Chase. Again, kind of make sure the information there, the website matches up. And then in the case of Chase and several of the major financial institutions, we actually have you sign in on the bank website and authenticate the account from there. When that happens, sometimes the clients have to perform the steps, because there are some banks that really want it to be the account holder that decides when the bank account data can be read by a third party. And in this case, the third party is QuickBooks Online. And I think that makes sense, right? They want to make super sure that the account holder approves of this kind of connection. So it may be your client that has to do it. Some financial institutions, they're okay with a secondary user forming the connection, right? So if you have like a read-only login for the bank website, that might work to form the connection. But if it doesn't, you may need your clients to do these steps. Now, the good news with that is that this should really only be a one-time thing, right? We're connecting it, and then it's connected going forward. All right, so the next step here is multi-factor authentication. Again, a security step that can vary a little bit from bank to bank. Account holder might need to complete steps. We're all used to this, right? Getting texts or emails with special codes to keep everything secure and safe. This is an important screen, especially if your client has multiple QuickBooks Online accounts, multiple bank accounts under one login. So this is the part where we are giving Intuit access to the bank accounts, and this is a connection that's kind of happening regardless of how many QuickBooks Online accounts you have. So you're going to check off the accounts that you want QuickBooks to be able to talk to. So if your client, when we sign into Chase, they've got multiple bank accounts, multiple credit cards, you pick the ones that you want QuickBooks to be able to talk to in their main company, and maybe they only have one, but even if they have multiple QBO companies, you'll want to check this off, because this is really just the overall permission for QuickBooks, not specific to that company file. Might not apply to many of your clients, but I do tend to see that a lot, especially if you work at a larger firm and your clients have, 5, 6, 7 QuickBooks Online accounts for different entities under the client. That this screen can trip people up sometimes. Hope that makes sense. Okay, and then the next screen, this is specific to that particular company file, that particular QBO account. So this is where you are mapping it up to the corresponding chart of accounts account, right? So if maybe there's a nickname or something on the bank website, you're going to match it up to where it's going in the chart of accounts. And then how much data you want to pull in for that initial download. I suggest basing this on the last reconciliation that took place. So by default, we typically will bring in like 90 days worth of transactions, but if you're already reconciled through the end of September, you probably don't want to bring in August and September transactions, because we're not going to try and match those up to things that have already been reconciled. Hope that makes sense. So since the bank feed happens before we go into reconciliation, you're not going to want to have extra transactions. Or if you do, say that you pick this year or whatever, and you've already reconciled the first 5, 6 months, you could exclude those transactions to avoid duplicates. But to me, it's easier if we bring in the time frame we need from the get-go. On the flip side, you may be taking on a new client and they haven't reconciled for the whole year and they haven't used the bank feeds at all, and utilizing the bank feeds to really match up against what's already there and add anything that's missing can help you get the books up to speed really quickly, right? So on the flip side, you may choose to bring in everything depending on where the client is when you go to do this for the first time. Oh, somebody's saying they can't hear me. Can any of you hear me? If one of you can hear me, then everyone should be able to. Okay, a bunch of others are saying they can hear me. So Kaylee, it might be something with your speakers. Oh, she can't hear me, so let me type that to her. Hang on. Okay, thank you all. And then someone said, where would we go to download your slides? On the GoToWebinar panel, there should be a little section for handouts. So the same place that you found the question box, there should be a little handout section to download as well. It looks a little different on your end than my end, so I'm not 100% sure if it's at the top or bottom, but it should be right on that panel. Okay, they still can't hear me. Sorry, folks. Don't mean to slow us down with this. All right, but didn't want to, if none of you could hear me, I didn't want to be talking to myself, right? Okay, so we just talked through how we connect up a financial institution to have that ongoing connection. Alternative is a file upload. Like I said, we download that data from the bank website, and this is the screen you get to. You'll browse and find that file on your computer, and then it guides you through mapping that up. And here's some of the reasons you might use this. Bank doesn't have a connection option to QuickBooks Online, although, again, we've got thousands of financial institutions that connect, so always make sure you look for it before you assume it's not there. If you want to bring in more than 90 days, a very specific time frame, we've added that custom date range as an option. It used to be that you couldn't pick your own date range as easily as you can now, but sometimes people like massaging this in Excel a little bit or something before they bring it in, so you could bring in a specific period that way. And then as a backup method. And of course, if you're running into connectivity issues, please work with our support teams to get those reported, and hopefully we can work with you to figure out what's going on with that bank. Okay, and I promise this isn't all slides. We're going to jump into the product in just a moment. It's just faster to show the bank connections with slides. But before we do, let's just really quickly talk through some terminology here so that it makes more sense when I jump in. Really three things that happen when the bank transactions come in. First, QBO looks for a match. Those show up as similar records found, so that's something already entered into the books that we could pair the bank transactions up with. Second thing we do, if we don't find a match, we look for any rules that you or your client created. And we'll go through how to create rules and what those look like. And then if there's not a match or a rule, we're going to make a guess based on past behavior. So if I told QuickBooks that Office Depot was office expenses, it's going to remember that the next time that Office Depot expense shows up on the bank feed. So those show up as green as recognized transactions. Now that's actually a setting that you can turn off if you want to. If you don't want QBO to keep remembering how transactions are categorized, you can turn that off going forward now. There's a spot under the small gear. We'll look at that when we get into the product. And then if we don't find a match, a rule, or a recognized transaction, we might make a guess, right? We see something that looks, hey, you know, this Subway looks like it could be a travel meal. We might make that suggestion based on what we may know about that vendor. And then if we really don't know what it is, it comes through as uncategorized. Now there's also transactions that appear to be transfers, moving money from one account to another. If both accounts are connected, you would want to transfer in one account, right, one bank feed, and then match the transfer in the other, right? So the money coming out of one account gets transferred, and then the money coming into the other account gets matched. Now, if something comes through and it looks like a transfer, but it's not, you can switch it to add instead. And then it'll look for a match, or you can add it from the bank feed. Okay, let's jump into QuickBooks Online here. We'll come back to some slides in a bit. So a few things I want to point out. The first is if you go into the Overview tab. So if you're an accountant and you go into a client's QuickBooks Online, in addition to the dashboard that you come to when you sign in, you have an overview tab. And I love this because we surface information around the banking activity for you in addition to a bunch of other stuff here. So for the bank accounts in the chart of accounts, if they're connected up, you'll see that bank balance versus what's in QuickBooks, how many transactions are unaccepted, meaning we haven't matched or added them, and then what the reconciliation status is as well. So how many unreconciled transactions and when these accounts were reconciled through. So if I was taking on this client as a new client, right, they come to me, I get access to their QuickBooks Online and might go, oh, wow, we've got a lot of work to do to get these accounts up to date. Hopefully your client's books won't be quite as messy as this test account, but I hope you get the idea here. Now, if there is not a connection formed, right, if we're not working with transactions that came from the bank, it'll tell us no bank data. These are QuickBooks transactions only. So this second column is just the register, right, whereas this first column is the information we're actually getting from the bank itself. Now, file upload accounts will still show up here, but they show up with a zero bank balance. And we're going to see that when we go into the banking tab as well. So I will have cards along the top that represent each bank account that I've either connected up or that I've done file uploads for. And the easy way to tell if an account with a file upload instead of a connection is that they tend to show a zero bank balance, and then a lot of times it'll say something like it's been however many days since you brought in a file. I uploaded one 3 hours ago, so it's telling me that. And then for these accounts, I actually clicked update just before we started the webinar, so it's saying it was updated moments ago. And I toggle between these cards to work in each account's bank feed. The other way I can tell is if I go to edit this, I'm editing the account info. And with this, if I click onto it and I click the edit, it shows it's a file upload account from here. So that's another way to tell. Okay, so down below, I have my for review tab, reviewed and excluded. In the for review, we have all the transactions we haven't matched or added yet. I could sort these by date, description, payee, category or match, money spent, money received. Personally, I like looking at category or match because then I can see what matches it picked up for things already in the books first and work through those, and then move into what's got a rule, and then anything in green, again, is recognized. Gray is our intelligent guess or uncategorized. So you can look at this in a number of different ways, whatever works best for you. There's also a couple of filter options here. We can filter to a certain date range. We can look at everything or just look at what QuickBooks has recognized. And then under the small gear in the upper right, you'll have some options related to the columns and the actual settings on this table. So throughout QuickBooks Online, if you ever see a small gear, it means you can configure the table you're looking at. So in this case, I could add or remove some columns. And then for transaction details, these are some settings related to how this information shows up. And I'll come back to those in a minute here. So let's look at this. So if I click to expand the record found, I have a link to look at this open invoice that the bank feed thinks this payment might be a match against. So if I wanted to look at that, I could, or I can just match if I'm confident that it is one. Same here. I could click Find Other Records if I thought that this wasn't a match with that bank feed transaction, if I wanted to look through what's already in the books. Whatever details we got from the bank will show down below here. I'm going to zoom in on that. Right? So we would see the actual info from the bank. And what QuickBooks Online does is it kind of takes this and makes a cleaned up description. Now, if that cleaned up description doesn't work very well for you, for your client's bank, you can go under the small gear and change that to show bank details. And you'll notice now this has kind of a lot going on, right? It's a little ugly on the eyes, but it does give a bit more information than that cleaned up description without having to expand these out. So I know some folks like to have that turned on. If there is a rule applied, we would see what rule that is. We still have the option in this case to make some changes before we add that into the books. So the rule has kind of automatically filled some of this stuff out for us. Now your options here are going to depend on what's turned on in your client's settings, right? So you can go into the gear, into accountant settings, and turn things on and off to configure their account. So in this case, my client is marking expenses as billable. So they've turned that on as a setting. They are using class and location tracking. So if your client doesn't have that stuff turned on, you're not going to see some of these options here, right? Now, if I wanted to look at the rule, I could. Again, I've got the bank detail, and I could add attachments as I add things, split the transaction if I needed to. So I can do that down the line. Now, I'm going to show you what happens when we have that remembering category selection on. So these are a bunch of transactions from the same burrito place, it looks like. Now, QBO remembers that we told it that this was travel meals in the past, but let's say that I change it to something else. We'll change it to something kind of silly. So when I tell it it's office expenses once, it's going to say here, we're setting burrito to office expenses from now on. I could edit this setting and say, hey, QuickBooks, leave that uncategorized. I want to decide what it is each time it comes in. Or I could create a custom rule around it and set some conditions that tell QuickBooks how to treat that transaction. Or if I don't do that, it's just if I've got that remember turned on, I'm going to add that, and it's going to kind of apply that going forward. Now, I could decide if I did, we'll change this to something else here. I could decide, hey, leave that uncategorized. When I save that, the subsequent transactions that are similar just come through as uncategorized, and I decide each time. That's kind of a rule in and of itself. But the alternative would be, if it really doesn't work for me at all, I could turn off the remember category selection across the board. But most will keep that on unless they really have, you know, a high volume of transactions that vary a whole bunch. Okay, so that's adding and matching transactions. Again, if we suspect that something is already in the books, we can use find match to look for a transaction that this could pair up against, and we can use our filters to find it and match those up. That's what you would also use if maybe there's a potential match, but you think that there's going to be a dollar difference discrepancy or something, right? What was in the books isn't quite being recognized as a match because the dollar amount is different. That happens sometimes, right? Whoever entered it didn't include the tax or didn't include a fee that's on there or whatever. So that's another reason to look for find match if you know that the client's been putting those transactions in the books manually. I also see that used a lot for checks, right? To use the find, because sometimes the checks don't necessarily get picked up. That can depend a little bit on how the financial institution sends the check information over. So if you turn on the column for check number, some banks will actually put the check number in, and unfortunately I don't have any checks in this this test data to show you, but sometimes the check number will be there, and that makes it easier to match something up. Other times the banks don't give us any of those details. It just says check on what the bank sends over, and then it's a bit harder to form matches. And I noticed that somebody did ask about that, so the best way to reconcile and process them. So I see checks handled in a couple different ways depending. If it is easy enough to, if you see a check, to use the find match and pair it up that way. If it becomes really cumbersome, I know some folks will exclude the checks in the bank feed and then just decide to, you know, manually mark those as cleared in the register when the time comes. Checks tend to be tricky because the banks just don't give us a lot of information off of the check other than that it's a check and what the dollar amount is. So if the dollar amount isn't a tell for you, then it can be a little harder to pair those up. hopefully your clients are moving away from using checks anyway, right? Starting to use more ACH and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's get into rules. So as we saw, I could create a rule as I'm adding transactions, or I can come up to my rules tab along the top here and see all of the rules that have been created in this account, either by myself or one of the other users. I can add new rules, edit existing, and manage all of that from here. So let's edit a rule for the sake of time. But I do have a couple of things about rules on a slide here, so let me pull that up real quick. Okay, so as we are matching and adding, QBO is learning as we go, but rules take us a step beyond that kind of automatic memorizing that's happening in the background as we add and match transactions. Rules allow us to set specific conditions so that when the information comes through the bank feed, if it doesn't find a match, it's going to look at your rules and really save you time by taking a peek at the conditions that you set up. You've got some extra options when you are deciding what you want this rule to do. You can split by percentage or dollar amount, and you can even have certain rules automatically get added straight into the register and bypass the review process entirely. So here's the anatomy of a rule, and then I'll open up a couple to give you some examples. I give the rule a name. For number 2, I decide, is this a rule for money in or money out transactions? And then which bank accounts will this rule apply to, right? Because I could have transactions get treated a different way when they come through certain accounts. I was working with an accountant recently that their client does heavy class tracking, but they track certain bank accounts into different classes. And so they set up a bunch of rules for just that one account to go to the class that they wanted to, for example. And then I set up my conditions. So with conditions, we have the option for any or all. If it's all, it's going to look at every line you add here and make sure the transaction meets all of those conditions before it takes action. If it's any, it could be any of those lines, right? And it'll set up one or more of the following down below. So then the bottom half here, number 6, that's where we tell QuickBooks what to do. All right, if these conditions are true up top, and you can go off of the bank text, the description, that cleaned up QuickBooks description we talked about, the dollar amount, a combination of those if you want. You tell it, is this in the case of money out, is this an expense or is this a check? And then you record the details, right, at number 8. What payee, what category, what class, if your client's using classes. Do we want to split this? So you can split a transaction across different categories, right? Those are your GL accounts, or different classes, or a combination thereof. You can split up to 20 different ways by dollar amount or percentage. And then your location, that's assigned at the transaction level, right? So it's not in the lines of the categories. Memo, if you want something special to populate there. And then the last one is, are we having this automatically add to the books? Bypass the register, bypass the review and go straight into the register? Or do we want to still get a chance to look at the rules, how the rule applied, and make a decision to automate it later? So here's what this looks like in action. So I edited an existing rule that I had set up. My client has a storage rental expense that they just have automatically ACH withdrawn from their account every month. I'm sure if you think about your client's transactions, they probably have some fees that they pay each month for things that are automatic, right? Subscriptions that they have, services that they use that are the same every month, perhaps. So in this case, it's storage rental. I chose money out. I've got it coming out of all bank accounts, but really if I knew which account it always comes from, I could just pick that one. And then when the transaction meets, in this case, I'm saying all conditions. And I'm saying if the bank text contains life storage number 560 and the amount equals $66.82, there is nothing else that could be for my client than their storage rental expense. So I'm telling QuickBooks if these two things are true, record it as an expense, the pay is live storage, and in their case, I'm splitting it across two different classes for whatever reason, right? I could add different lines. I could split it across different accounts as well and just keep adding lines to split as needed by dollar amount or percentage. And then do I want to auto-categorize and auto-add? So when a transaction from Live Storage that's $66.82 comes through, I don't even have to look at it. It goes right into the books. Or the manual review allows me to still open it, take a peek at it before it goes into the register. And then apply rule, that's a newer option to turn a rule off without deleting it. So sometimes people just want to turn something off for a while. Okay, so that's one example. There's a lot of examples I could give of different rules I see folks create. I'm going to show you another one that's any of these conditions. So client might use a lot of different taxis and rideshare services. So I created a rule that says, all right, if any bank text has taxi or Uber or Lyft or rideshare in the name, let's have this come in as an expense. Maybe I set up a general vendor for taxis. I've seen people do this with restaurants, gas stations, things that aren't, 1099 vendors or whatever that we could kind of generally lump together. Remember, we're always going to be able to look back at the bank detail because that's going to be on that saved transaction. And you can even have that copy into the memo field as well, which I encourage folks to do. So then I chose a expense account here, class if necessary. And in this case, maybe I decide I want to review it just in case, something picks up that's not a rideshare. I don't know. A lot of the times I say, create the rule, set it up to just manually review, and then once you're confident that that rule is working, you can always come in, edit this, and have it be an auto add. But that auto add is going to save you a lot of time. So once we set up our set of rules here, a lot of the types of transactions that your clients have all the time, right, that you might not need to look at every individual one, you could have those automatically get added to the books. So when I come in and look at the transactions for review, these are some manual rules. But when I look over at the Reviewed tab, this is all the stuff that I've matched and added or has auto-added to the books. And if there's a little icon here in front of the rule, that means that these transactions automatically came in. So I guess I don't have a ton of them in this client, but I've certainly seen books where they set up enough rules to catch all the different stuff that clients have coming in all the time, or money out, right? We can set up money out rules. I know I'm using expenses as my primary examples today, but we could do that for those as well. And then it's really just catching the unusual things in the bank feed, right? Now, somebody did ask about checks. I have seen people set up rules for check to at least flag those for attention. So I've seen someone create a rule, and I should have taken a screenshot or something of what they did. But they basically, if the bank text contained check, they had it go into a account like Ask My Accountant or an uncategorized account or something that kind of let them know later we've got to go in there and review those to see what they are. So that's one idea. I don't know how well that works in practice, but it is something I saw a practitioner do once to kind of catch the rare checks that their clients had and be sure that they took a closer look at those later, because it helped prevent them from having the client mess things up by just guessing at what it is or whatever. Okay, so a couple other quick things in the rules here. I can move these around to prioritize one rule over another if I've got rules that are similar. I can edit existing, of course, copy, delete. One of the reasons I see copy used is I could have a rule that says, if a transaction is greater than this, it gets treated as one thing. If it's less than this amount, it gets treated as something else. So that's one way I see copy utilized. And then probably my favorite thing here that sometimes gets overlooked is under the new rule dropdown, you can export rules out and then import them into another company. So if I do that, I can just bring in a set of rules that I've already created and save myself some time. It'll guide you through, when you do an import, it guides you through uploading that list via Excel, picking the rules off of it you want, and then mapping the details of the rule to that company's chart of accounts and customer and vendor lists and class lists and so on. So that can save you a lot of time if you've got clients that have multiple companies, or if you've got clients that fall into a specific niche. I was working with a firm once in Seattle that all of their real estate clients had all the same kind of expenses around, UPS stores, FedEx, their gas stations in the area, all that kind of stuff that they set up a standard set of rules for to really help them save time, rental cars, that kind of thing. And you can create rules for money in as well. I've seen that used in a lot of different ways depending on the industry. I was working with a firm not too long ago that set up a bunch of rules for transfers between one account and another. And they also set up a bunch of rules for reimbursements that they were getting. I think it was from an insurance company or something like that. So they identified some opportunities for money in transactions as well to get that stuff automated. So best advice I can give you is, review the kinds of transactions that your clients have coming in all the time and try and set up some rules to help save getting those into the books accurately. Okay, I told y'all that the bank feed is my favorite part of QuickBooks Online. I could probably talk the whole hour just about this, but let's move on to reconciliation unless there's any questions here for me. Looks like we're doing pretty well. Oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you about two quick things here. So one is this excluded tab. So I mentioned before, if you connect up the account initially, or if the client connects the account, or if something strange and unusual happens, you may have reasons to exclude transactions to avoid having any duplicates in the books. So that, the way that that's done is, say that we already reconciled May and June, and I don't want these transactions to get added in. I can check those off. If you need to check a whole bunch of stuff, you can hold down Shift to check off and batch. But I check off what I need, and then I have under batch actions the option to exclude. So that's really the only way to move something into that excluded sort of holding cell. And then you can go into excluded and permanently delete, or if you make a mistake, there is an option to undo from there as well. Batch actions is also a way that you can batch modify, right? So maybe I sort these by description, and we'll come back to our burrito transactions here. I could modify all of these at once, right? I could add my payee and category, apply and add that. That's super helpful if you're doing an initial file upload, right? Say you're bringing in a whole year's worth of transactions. You can sort and, grab the handful of Home Depot expenses that your client has and get those all coded to supplies or whatever all at once and add those in all at once. So I see that used a lot, right? Use the sorting, use the batch actions to get through a large volume of transactions really quickly, and then maybe consider setting up rules to use going forward, because you can create the rules as you go as well. And then finally, when we're in reviewed, this is where we see added or matched. We see if a rule was applied. Whenever we look at a transaction in the future, let me find a good one here. Okay, here's some gas stations. If I were to open this transaction, whether it's from here or report, in the upper left-hand corner, I have a little link to see the online banking match. So that's always going to show me what from the bank was this paired up against, and was it manually added? Was it added with a rule? Was it an automatic add with a rule? So I can get a sense of how that transaction got into the books and then how it was paired up with that banking match as well. So let's get into reconciliation. And I do, can we talk about matching deposits? All right, so that is a great question. So if you have a deposit that comes through, and we're trying to pair it up against, I'm assuming, existing payments that have been entered in and coded to undeposited funds. Couple of ways you could do it. What I mostly see people do is actually recording the deposit in and then matching a bank deposit that was entered here to a deposit that comes through the bank feed. But if you didn't want to do that, that's a case where you would use find a match. And I unfortunately don't have a transaction with money received to show you this well, but well, here we'll look at. So I'm looking at money spent, but it'll be similar here. So when I do find a match, I would look for basically payments, right? Or I could look at everything, and then if I had any customer payments here that I'm matching up that deposit, I would check those off, and then those will get paired up against that deposit. I know I'm kind of showing the opposite here, but that would be how I do it without going in and recording a bank deposit. And then if it's just payments that have not been recorded to undeposited funds, if they were recorded to the bank account itself, then those would be something that you could match up in the find match area as well. But I say, have your clients get into the habit of using undeposited funds for sure. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's get into reconciliation, and I've just got another quick polling question for you before we do. I'm curious, have you used rules for any of your clients, the bank rules? Okay. Very cool. I'll give everybody just another moment to respond. And thank you. This kind of helps me make sure I'm focusing on the right things in these sessions. Okay, so yeah, about a quarter of you have been using the rules already, so hopefully it gave you some ideas on using them going forward. And then several of you had not used rules yet, about a third of the group, so that's wonderful. Hopefully that was helpful. So let's switch over into reconciliation. And of course, you're accounting professionals, but just in case anybody snuck in who's not, the idea for reconciliation is that we are matching the bank statement, the statement that we got from the financial institution, against what's in QuickBooks and getting them to agree. So we want the bank account and the books to have a $0 difference between them, and this is kind of the stamp of approval that that process has been completed when we finish a reconciliation. So the workflow here, pretty straightforward. We get that bank statement. This is the step that people sometimes forget. Verify, if you're using the bank feed, verify that all the transactions for that period have been accepted. You don't want anything for that time frame sitting in for review. You want to add and match first, right? The bank feed's the first leg of reconciliation. So we want to take care of anything sitting in review for that period so that we don't end up with duplicates down the road. Resolve any discrepancies from the last reconciled. So when we go into the reconcile page, it will flag us and alert us if there have been changes to that bank account since the last time we reconciled. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. We'll stage up a discrepancy report to resolve those. Enter the statement details, statement ending date, and the balance. For bank accounts that we've connected up, you don't have to enter fees and interest earned. I know everybody's in the habit of doing that, but if we connected to the bank account, those transactions came in through the bank feed, and you probably already added or matched them from there, right? So we don't have to key that stuff in manually. If we don't have this account connected to the bank feed, we will have the fields to enter those in. And then we'll go through reviewing the transactions. We'll use the filters to narrow and troubleshoot anything that may be missing or needs attention. And we get to a $0 difference. We can finish our reconcile, or we can close without saving it. If it's a credit card account, asks you if you want to pay the bill, and then you can, of course, review and print the reports if desired. So let's do a reconcile here. So we would choose the bank account that we want to reconcile. It'll show us our last statement ending date. If there was a discrepancy here, we would have a big red box that would alert us to it. And then I'm just going to enter some information from a fake statement here that we put together. So our ending balance and our ending date. And we'll start reconciling this up. All right, so along the top, we see our statement ending balance minus our cleared balance, so we're getting to that $0 difference, and then beginning balance, and then what payments and deposits make that up. So we have a whole breakdown of that up top. If there was an issue with the ending balance that we entered in at the statement ending date, we can click Edit Info and tweak that as needed. But that should be the information that's on the bank statement, of course. So we're hoping to get to a $0 difference. So I just started reconciling, and I'm already at one. And the reason for that is we added transactions through the bank feed, and those are marked as cleared in the register. So when we go to reconcile, they're already checked off because we already know that that information happened at the bank. Now, if you don't like that, if you want to go through line by line and compare it against the statement, you absolutely can. You would just uncheck that top box, and that'll unselect everything, and then you'll have the more kind of traditional way of going through this, right, where we look at the bank statement and check off each line as we go, and it will approach that $0 difference as we do so. But in a perfect world, we've done all the heavy lifting in the bank feed, and we can give this a once over and hopefully trust that, this $0 difference really means that everything got put in correctly. Now, I know we don't live in a perfect world, so there might be times where we're not at a $0 difference, even if we are using the bank feed, because stuff got entered in wrong, and we've got to figure out what happened. That's where your filters and your small gear are going to come into play. So when we look at the anatomy of the reconciliation tool, we've got in the upper left a filter. By default, we're looking at transactions as of the statement ending date. I could clear that out if I want to look at everything that's sitting in the register here. I can also use the find. I can type by the memo, reference number, dollar amount greater than or less than to narrow down my results, cleared status, transaction types, payees, and of course that date range. As far as what we're looking at, so we've got all transactions together. I can narrow this to just look at payments, just look at deposits, look at everything all at once. How you view this may depend on the layout of the client statement, right? If they've got all that stuff together, if they've broken it into groups. And then we have our columns along the top. Now we can configure those again in the small gear to add and remove columns that would apply to this client. You can change this to be ultra compact if you want, or regular. Remember when I said it's a great idea to keep that memo, copy to memo turned on in the bank feed? The reason for that is then you have the actual memo, the details from the bank and the bank feed in this column, which I think is super useful as I go through and review what payee has been assigned, right? I can refer back to the memo and make sure that these make sense. If something's missing, I can click to expand the details and actually assign the payee from here if I wanted, if I've got that in here somewhere. I guess if I need to go add a vendor, then I might leave that blank for now, but I could also click edit to open up the whole transaction. I get questions around this date versus cleared date. So if it is a connected account, the cleared date is the date that the bank gave us versus the date column is what was in QuickBooks. So if I matched a transaction, the date might be a little different, right? The date here is when it was entered into QuickBooks perhaps, and then the cleared date is when it posted on the bank's website. So if you see some differences there, sometimes that impacts this difference up above, and we tend to give you a little flag that tells you if there's perhaps something outside of the statement ending date, but the cleared date is within it that will help this match up. This column here will show us what the banking status was, right? So when I hover over these, manually added from the bank feed, automatically added with a bankroll, so that helps me tell at a glance how the transaction got there and how it ended up cleared, right? And then if we need to, again, drill into any of these, we can to open up the whole transaction and look at it and make some inline changes if we needed to without having to go all the way to the register to do so. Now, of course, if I get to that $0 difference, I can finish now. I can save for later, close without saving if I want to start over. But we will finish now. And I can view my reconciliation report from here or say that I'm done. In the upper right-hand corner, I'll have a summary that shows me all the reconciliations that have happened for these accounts. So I can get a summary breakdown. History by account. I pick the bank account I want, the date range, and it sort of collapses this up by year, but I can expand it to see the reconciliations that have taken place and any changes and auto adjustments. The main action is to view the reports. As an accountant user, you also have the option to undo a past reconciliation. So your clients won't see that drop down to undo. They'd have to go into the register and change those, R's to C's or remove the letter entirely one by one. If I try and undo a previous one, it wants me to do a batch, right? It'll want me to undo that one and every one after it. So I view the report, shows me when it was reconciled, who it was reconciled by, and I can drill into these. Now, I'm going to make a change to the reconcile I just did so I can show you what it looks like if a change took place. So we'll change this dollar amount just for the sake of example. Now, it's going to tell me, hey, this was matched in the bank feed. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Hey, this was already reconciled. Are you sure you want to do this? Pretend I'm a bad client right now. Yes. What do we turn on in QuickBooks to prevent the clients from even getting those options? Somebody weigh in the question box. Is there something we can turn on to prevent them from doing that? Let's see if anybody weighs in with it. Lock down the books. Yeah. Close the month. Yes. So what I do recommend as a best practice is after you complete a reconciliation, if you don't want somebody to go in and do what I just did, under the gear in account and settings, there is a spot under advanced settings to close the books. And you can set a closing date and then only allow changes from before that date if someone views a warning or views a warning and enters a password, which I think is the recommended way. I know somebody whose password is no, 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 or what are you doing? That'll really help prevent them from even getting that option to change something that's been reconciled or that was matched against the bank fee. But let's say that they did, right? That'll show up as a change at the top of the report. And then also when I go to reconcile again, we get that red box. Hey, your beginning balance is off. We can help you fix it. I know a lot of professionals that will ignore that and go and try and fix it elsewhere. I recommend you click onto that because that is our discrepancy report in QuickBooks Online. So it will show anything here that impacts the balance on these transactions, right? If it's a dollar amount change, if the transaction was deleted, it'll also show if the reconciliation status was changed. And we tell you what happened, right? Here's the reconciled amount, here's the amount now, the difference, the amount changed, and there's even a link here to view the audit log. If you aren't using the audit log in QuickBooks Online, it is a user's best friend, right? Especially if you're trying to trace back what happened. This is going to show the whole history of any edits that have taken place, and you can see I was in here doing all sorts of stuff today, but it'll highlight what changed. I can click compare to see those changes side by side, and I know when it happened and who did it. So that can help me, give a call to the client and say, hey, why'd you change this transaction by $100? And then hopefully we figure out why, and we can change it back from here to resolve that difference. And we're going to get some warnings again, but that'll clear out this discrepancy report, and now we are ready to reconcile. So again, some of the things that will impact that changed after it was reconciled, and that change affected the balance. So if somebody goes in and changes the account from the GL, right, that it was categorized to, or changes the class or the vendor, those types of things don't affect the balance, so they won't show up, but changing the amount, deleting it, and then changing the status in the register will show up on that report. And then I did include in the deck, if you download the slides, a little note on that cleared date, right? Because sometimes that throws folks off. If something was entered in that falls after the statement period, you might get a little warning along the top to show hidden transactions. And that will automatically pop those up and help you get things reconciled. So I wanted to include that. I've also got some links to articles. There are a few things that we didn't quite get into today with, troubleshooting connectivity stuff. Sub-accounts for company credit cards. I know that doesn't come up for everyone, but if you've got a client that, has multiple employees with different cards, typically what you do is you connect up the sub-accounts, so they're like child accounts, each employee's card to the bank feed, but not the parent, and then you reconcile the parent. So there's some advice around how to handle that. There's a couple of scenarios where you've got to do something different, but hopefully these will help you through if you've got questions. And then I know we're right at time, but I will stick around to see if anybody asked anything here. What transactions recorded as indirect edits in the audit log? That's a great question. So when we were in my audit log, there were some things that showed up as indirect edits. Typically those are, here, let me come back to it. So you all know whenever you're on a transaction in QBO, you get to it from a report or wherever else, you can go to more and look at the audit history. So typically indirect edits are a result of me doing something else that changes some field of this transaction in the background. So in this case, it was when I reconciled the account. So it went from being cleared to reconcile. So that wasn't something I directly went in and did, but because I took action elsewhere in QuickBooks, it sort of changed one of these things on the back end. Another indirect edit it can be like if you're entering in a deposit, that's going to indirectly edit the payments that are included in that deposit. So those are the types of things that impact that. Typically, we're mostly concerned with when things are added and edited by users, right? But other actions can certainly take an effect, and those will show up in the background. So I can get to the audit history from any transaction, or I can go to the audit log under the gear. And as we saw, we have shortcuts there in the discrepancy report as well. Somebody said, can this may be off topic, but can you explain transactions types as they pertain to the 1099s? Ooh, we could probably talk about 1099 stuff for another hour. Melissa, I will follow up with you after the webinar, and we can talk through some of that if you'd like. I'm happy to set up some time for it. Okay, well, I certainly hope this was helpful. Thanks for sticking around for a couple of moments as we wrapped up and answered some questions. Let me know, was this session helpful? I've got a little poll here, but you'll also get a little survey when you leave. So I appreciate you spending some of your afternoon with me today, and thank you so much for joining. Take care, everyone.